Welcome back, everybody. Today we are starting a new series. We are going back to the beginning of D.Gray Man and going chapter by chapter till we catch up to where my first D.Gray Man chapter review was, which was roughly chapter 247, I believe. It might have been 246. I honestly could have checked beforehand, but the point is, it's a lot of chapters that we're going to catch up on. I find that with the pace of releases for D.Gray Man, we tend to all get lost in what is actually happening. So these chapter reviews will try to link stuff that happened in the past to what we are seeing currently in the manga. And that way we can all have a better understanding of what's going on. I know personally, whenever a new chapter comes out, I'll read the 5-ish chapters before then, and then anything that I vaguely remember from a previous arc before I do my review, so that I have enough information to talk about going into it. So before anything here, I gotta say, if you have been read D.Gray Man or seeing this because you just read chapter 1, I would avoid this to some extent. Feel free to come back later, but I'm going to at least spoil a little bit of it. I'm going to try to keep it high level stuff where it's like concepts that I see in the early chapters that are more fleshed out later, and I'm like, it was foreshadowed here, and explain that a little bit. But I'll try to avoid being like, this is important because X and Y happen later in chapter 62, and it's only able to happen because this happening right now. I feel like that's more related to whatever would happen in chapter 62 in that example. But I might make a note that this is an important scene to keep track of. So, like I said, I'm trying to make it have value for both first time or never readers of D.Gray Man, along with those who are caught up in the manga, not being like, this mysterious guy with a weird arm shows up in the first chapter. Because obviously, if you know the story at all, you know that's Alan. You know that's the main character. So, with all that said, if you want to stick around, here's chapter 1. So, chapter 1 is named Opening, and it sticks to the theme of the nights, because as we all know, each chapter of D.Gray Man is night 1, night 2, and so on and so forth. So it's funny because it then would be opening night, essentially, which makes sense for as a first chapter in the story. And this came back in May of 2004, which really makes me feel old right now. Not to say that I was reading this back in 2004, but the fact that it's been that long since the series has been running, and it really is a testament to just some of the delays that happen with the story. I don't blame the author Hoshino because she has carpal tunnel, so I'm just happy she does it at all still. But for instance, One Piece came out in 1999, only 5 years earlier, and it has more than 5 times the chapters pretty much, or just about. So take it with a grain of salt. But anyways, just want to show how accomplished the series is, and all of you guys along with me as fans of the series hopefully keep this story going until we get to the satisfying conclusion that I know hopefully will be. As you can probably tell, D.Gray Man is my number 1 manga/anime, and assuming it doesn't do anything too crazy or any Deus Ex Machinas out of nowhere, it probably is safe in that spot, if not top 5 by the end of its run. So the chapter starts out with a little excerpt just saying kind of what an exorcist is. They are those who are possessed by gods to fight the darkness. And the key thing here is that it says gods plural. This is already kind of getting a little bit spoilery, but the whole concept of D.Gray Man is it's a holy war. And the exorcists are on the side of the Vatican Church, which is inherently known as Catholic. So Catholic Christianity as a religion is monotheistic. So from that vein, you'd figure it would say God singular. And mind you, I have the Viz translation, so it's not just me seeing this on a weird translation that says gods in general. Once again, it is its own world. This could be where the Vatican is not one-to-one. There is still the Pope, which I recently made a video on, if you want to look on how mysterious the Pope character is and how we really haven't seen him in the story, but he's been mentioned. Check that video out. I might try to mark that right here in the video. But It's interesting. You can make the argument that it's the actual God plus the Heart of Innocence could be like an angel, which to the average person in the story may be like a secondary God. Like the Holy Trinity, so to speak. And I'm not Christian, so I don't want to butcher that, but it's like that could hypothetically be what they mean by the multiple gods. Anyways, like that's just an excerpt. Like before the story starts, we also learn that this takes place roughly in the early 1900s, which makes sense. There's a few things like machinery wise that doesn't make sense for that time period, but its own world, it can justify whatever it wants to. And the story starts out kind of like a lot of these early mangas do, where we don't actually have the main character in the first panel. We are introduced to two police officers, Moa and Charles, who are investigating an abandoned church because a bunch of travelers tend to stay there when they're penniless, but then all of them have disappeared, only leaving their clothes behind. And they have gotten a bunch of complaints, so as the police, they have to go check that out. They go into the church, and it's just like abandoned. And like there was an accident there, which will play a part in this story. But they are then swarmed by bats because, once again, abandoned church. So bats started to live there. And they see a cat. So Moa picks up that cat and is ultimately berated or grabbed by a mysterious red hand and like drawn upstairs, while Charles is downstairs, like lost Moa and dealing with the bats. So when Moa ends up getting upstairs and getting oriented, she ends up seeing Alan and handcuffs him to be like, I caught you. What are you doing in this church, essentially? And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go for you. I was only going for the cat because that cat ate one of his treasured items or possessions, which, as we know later in the story, was Tim Campy, his golem, as an exorcist. So he's like, I'm sorry, I was just trying to get the cat. Naturally, she grabbed it, so she went upstairs with him. And it's like, what are you doing here? To which he reclaims, I'm a traveler, and I had to get the cat, so he went into the church. And Moa isn't believing him because he's like a 15-year-old at this point, and I guess Moa is at youngest 19, if not like 26. We don't really get her age. It doesn't really matter. She's a police officer. She probably had to go through training. And she's like, where's your master then? Because if it's your master's possession, why isn't he here? And the whole thing with General Cross, as we all know, he kind of abandons Alan. He's just in the middle of India right now, is what Alan guesstimates. And Moa just thinks this is kind of ridiculous. It's like, I'll get Charles first, and then we'll figure out how to deal with you moving forward. But before she can, she hears a scream from downstairs where she and Alan run down to find Charles, her partner, a character that doesn't really matter much after the story, but it's important that he gets his name remembered, tied to one of the pillars in the church somehow, with like a giant bullet hole through, maybe a cannonball sized hole actually, through his stomach. And he's in pain, and we see a black star on his face before ultimately seeing more of them pop up, and he essentially disintegrates out of being, leaving only his clothes, similar to all the other travelers that Moa and Charles went in to investigate. So after that happens, there's a bit of gas there that Alan covers Moa's mouth on because the gas from the Akuma poison, I guess, spoiler, it was Akuma poison, is also toxic, which is something we don't really see that often either. I feel like it's mostly just the bullets that we see are like dangerous from level 1 Akumas, but I guess it's also the gas. So she ends up fainting because he makes her hold her breath so that she doesn't get any of that gas into her system. So she wakes up back into the police station because Alan took her there, and they believe that Alan is the one who killed Charles because he has this weird hand that's red where it's like, well, it's covered in blood. And he's like, no, it isn't. This is just how my hand is. They see the weird cross on the back of it, which is the innocence, or the shard of innocence more specifically, that he has. And they think he's a lunatic because, like, why would anybody do that to themselves unless it was like for a deeply religious reason? And Detective Bullet, who's the one who's investigating him right now, is just like he's dead on, being like, "You're the one who killed him. Was nobody else there. It couldn't have been anyone else. Just admitted to you." But sadly for him, Moa walks in to be like, "He was with me the whole time. He couldn't have possibly been the one to kill Charles." So they're like, "Then who else was it?" Where Alan chimes in to be like, "It was an Akuma, a being that was created by the Maker or the Millennium Earl to destroy life and wreak havoc. I am an exorcist who are the ones in charge of saving the people from Akumas and like hunting them down." That's why episode 1 of D.Gray Man is called The One Who Hunts Akumas. So Bullet is kind of annoyed, thinks this is ridiculous, and essentially says, "Moa, you take him home with you. He's on house arrest essentially at your house. You deal with him, and we'll still look into Charles's murder." She doesn't want to say no to a supervisor, so they head back to Moa's house. While this is happening, we see a bunch of people on the street talking about the recent death of the police officer in the church. We also get hints of an accident, like I mentioned earlier, that happened in the church before. So they believe this church is just possessed. And in the background of this city street of people, we see this weird man. Okay, it's just a Millennium Earl. It's a Millennium Earl. I mean, if you're watching this, you know it's a Millennium Earl. And he's coming to visit Pastor Mark, being like, "Great job. I can't wait to see you evolve soon. Keep wreaking havoc." And just for me, this scene alone is very weird. Because why is the Millennium Earl actually stopping in this random town to visit a level 1 Akuma? Now, sure, we have seen him visit other Akumas in the past. Level 2s, I think he might have visited another level 1 at some instances, but overall, most of the time, he doesn't really visit these lower level Akumas because in Kyoto, he literally has all these level 3 Akumas and all these stronger Akumas, and that's like where his main forces are. Now, sure, it's been a level 1 for 2 years, so it's near evolving, but even then, he doesn't really visit level 2s unless they are on the hunt for a Shard of Innocence, which is where the story tends to go after Alan joins the Black Order. Like, it's the fight for innocence where they deal with level 2 Akumas on the regular. I guess that's spoiling some of the story, so I'm sorry. But I understand simply he's just here because it's the first chapter, but it is definitely weird and makes you wonder if he had plans for what Mark would have become as a level 2 Akuma. It doesn't matter, like I said, it's weird. But he's like, "Good job, keep going." So he keeps like cheering on the Akuma Mark, which I guess, spoilers, Mark was the Akuma. And then he hears Moa coming in. So he ends up disappearing so that Pastor Mark is in the house. And it turns out that Pastor Mark and Moa are related. She's his sister-in-law, and his wife or deceased wife was Moa's sister, and that had to do with the accident in the church. So she's still taking care of him because he's now in a wheelchair, and says, "Are you hungry?" Where he just replies, "I'm full," implying he ate Charles earlier. But that conversation kind of ends when she hears sounds from the other room, which is Alan trying to sneak out and go back to the church to hunt the Akuma down. Where she stops him being like, "You're in house arrest, you gotta stay here." The cat is just kind of chilling with Alan too now. The cat's like, "Whatever, he's not gonna do anything to me, I guess, until I let Tim Campy out of him." But she's like, "Do you really believe it's a demon? Because this is kind of ridiculous." And he's like, "Not in the metaphorical sense," because she explains like a demon is kind of like our subconscious way of explaining some of the bad stuff that happened throughout history. And he's like, "No, these are created by a certain maker," who, once again, is a Millennium Earl. Millennium Earl is not technically name dropped as the Millennium Earl until the end of chapter 1, and he's just referred to as the Maker. That's why I keep saying the Maker first when I think about it. And it's like he is the one who creates these Akuma. They are very difficult to spot because they look identical to humans when they're not in their attack forms, essentially. And this is when Mark comes in, and it is revealed to everybody who didn't know already, or I guess to Moa specifically and Alan, that Mark was the Akuma, because Alan has a special eye that allows him to see the souls of tortured Akumas. And the Akuma, Mark, is like, I'm hungry now, and turns into its battle form, which, let me just say, it's very nice as somebody who's back in chapter 250s right now to visit and see a level 1 Akuma. I honestly think the design for level 1 Akumas far surpass the design for level 3 Akumas. I don't think anything will beat a level 2 because there's just so many unique level 2 designs. But level 3's just kind of become unified again. That's a whole different conversation. The point is, like, they're just kind of like, or like oval spears with just like mortars attached to them and like a crying face. It's a very like powerful image for like what an Akuma needs to be, and it's a really like demented view, and I think that really encapsulates what an Akuma is well. So Mark kind of becomes a level 1 Akuma in his real form and just starts shooting the mortars everywhere, where Alan protects Moa by catching one of the bullets, which is more like a long cylindrical spear with like a triangular prism on the top. I don't know why I was trying to explain that in geometry. It's a bullet essentially with his Akuma hand, with his anti-Akuma weapon hand, because those are immune to the Akuma weapons. Like anything else that touches them outside of normal parasite use, which we'll find out later, would get essentially disintegrated like everybody in the church and Charles earlier in the story. Sadly, he wasn't able to protect the cat, so the cat ends up getting the black star on him as well, leading to him disintegrating and Alan being sad about that occurring. So we don't get to see Tim Campy here, but I guess anything inside of the being that was destroyed by the anti-Akuma weapon is then safe, or because of how unique Tim Campy is, Tim Campy seemingly can only be destroyed by a singular thing. So maybe he's just also immune to anti-Akuma weapons. And then now that like that all happened, he's just like, what happened to your brother? Or I guess brother-in-law. Because he starts explaining like how an Akuma is formed. It's like your brother was murdered, that Akuma is wearing his skin, kind of what was the tragedy that was linked to this occurring, because you need a tragedy for the Earl to then create an Akuma. It's explained a little later in this chapter, but she's kind of like in disbelief. And while this is going on, a bunch of Detective Bullet and a bunch of other cops show up. And they are just like, what are you two doing here? And try to shoot at the Akuma, but naturally it's immune to normal low-level bullets and shoots them with its mortar Akuma poison darts, I guess. I'll just keep bouncing around on how I want to name those, leading them all to disintegrate. This might be the chapter with the most on-screen deaths that we see in D.Gray Man, especially for a chapter 1, just in general in manga. But like, we got a solid at least 10 to 15 deaths that happened in the current story, not like a backstory death, which we do get one, which was Claire. But they're all dead. Moa's kind of in, but Alan just kind of keeps explaining to her like how Nakuma works. And this one part right here is something that I feel like is very important to what's happening in the current story, is how Alan explains Nakuma and like their energy source. I'm going to read this verbatim so that I can kind of make the analysis right after so you can hear it yourself. So it goes, the soul is ruled by the maker. These lost souls are those that are tormented by their sins. They hate this world, and it is all the pain and frustration of the tormented soul that serves as the energy source that feeds the Akuma and helps it reach its full potential. And then he also says that like this Akuma naturally also has a soul, which she kind of assumes to be her sister. So that part right there, I feel like perfectly encapsulates the power of the Akuma and potentially linking back to what we recently learned with Helix energy. So this is jumping all the way back to chapter 253 right now, where Bookman Jr. explains kind of how Helix energy works, since from like the weed and woes of fate, like essentially misfortune is how I kind of take that. And essentially through this tragedy is where enough Helix energy is generated that the Earl can then generate the soul back from heaven or hell or whatever the concepts of the afterlife is for the non-Akuma, bring it back, and then ultimately have it have enough power to function. And then naturally has to keep killing to then get more energy and evolve. And as it evolves, it twists the soul more. A level 2 looks a lot worse than a level 1. A level 1 is simply like the soul is just chained down to the Akuma. Level 2, it's in pain, and level 3 is so bad that Alan, who can see the Akuma's soul due to reasons that will be explained in later chapters. It's also nice that we don't really get to see the pentagram on his forehead until chapter 2. Is so bad that Alan actually barfs at the first sight of seeing it. It's just like, it's so traumatic for him. So with that said, we know that accommodators kind of choose it as those who have high helix energy on their own. Those are known to have really a lot of misfortune, which makes sense based on who we see later in the story. I mean, the next major arc for it, we know there's somebody who gets songs of bad luck about her and how like unlucky she is as a person. But overall, this feels like it's definitely implying that like this is helix energy and it's being set up all the way from the beginning of the story. That all said, we get into the backstory of Mark and Claire, where they're both happy. She's a nun, and he's the priest. Weird that she's a nun because they shouldn't be getting married, but I digress. They're all happy. They're celebrating. Mark's in a great place in his life when Claire is just kind of at the organ, playing music and telling Mark that I don't want Moa to become a police officer because she's only kind of becoming one to hunt down the man who killed their parents. See more death. And Mark's like, she's not doing that for them. She's doing that so that nobody else has to deal with the pain that you guys had to. And she'll be protected by God like all of us. Ironically, in the house of God, at that moment, the giant cross that's hanging from the ceiling, the rope breaks and completely like crushes Claire, which makes Mark go delirious. He's just like, I trusted you, God. How could you do this to me? He starts cursing out his own God, which naturally the Earl likes because the Earl doesn't believe in God. Assuming this is the same God of innocence, it's nice that like that's the kind of opposite that he likes. Maybe that's the reason why he's visiting Mark, because he thinks, as somebody who cursed out someone who he deeply believed in prior, that he could become a really powerful Akuma. But he tells them she can come back if you just call out her name and you miss her enough. So he yells out Claire, causing her name to be written on the machine, which I do like that we get to see the stupid Akuma build set, which is just so weird and like quirky in like an interesting way. For him to finally hear Claire's voice, and he's like, oh my God, you're back. Sure, you don't look the same, but I love you all the same. It doesn't matter. And then the Earl's like, she's mine now. Your first order is to kill the one you loved and wear his skin as your own. And the whole thing with an Akuma, and this is a video I'll make eventually, it's definitely like one of my standing points, is the Akuma might be the most evil thing in all of manga or anime, given its scale and given the fact that like it has to use the person who loves them and then makes them kill the one who comes back. Because they like come back and they're like cursing the other one, being like, I can't escape now. Why'd you turn me into an Akuma? Damn you, my loved one. And like the other person's just like, how can you say that to me? I love you so much. So anyways, she takes over, and then that's where the story is at with how she became an Akuma, or he became an Akuma. It's technically both, but it's really Claire. So after this is revealed to Moa, she's like, that can't be my sister, right? And there's in disbelief for Alan to read out a chant that I don't think he ever reads out again. So it's maybe something she wanted to do Hoshino wanted to do at the beginning, but then realized that it's kind of not that functional moving forward. Cross of God, inhabiting my body, lend me thy power to destroy the darkness now. And then his arm becomes the iconic giant gray arm, and he slashes the Akuma in a single slash, bringing Alan to say his, so to speak, catchphrase, brings salvation to this unfortunate Akuma's soul. Where, as you know, Alan's main philosophy is that we'll get this in the later chapter, or like next two chapters, really. So I'm actually gonna skip that for now. But Alan's philosophy is all about like saving Akumas, but it will have more details later. So I'll skip that for now in this chapter. So he's like, I'm sorry to the Akuma. It hurts, but you'll be okay soon. You'll be able to rest. So the Akuma is broken, and we see that the soul is no longer attached to the Akuma, turning the soul from like this weird, sad, like bony skeleton to her actual self crying and happy that she's leaving, which Alan can see, but nobody else can because of his eye. Which in chapter 1, you could argue it's implied that all exorcists actually have this eye to spot Akumas because we don't learn why Alan has the eye yet. So, and as the only exorcist we see, that is a fact that we could just know. We could just assume, which would be wrong. So naturally, Moa's happy that she's safe now, but is like, I wonder if she's in heaven. Alan consoles her, and then essentially says, it's the Millennium Earl who is the maker. Like, we finally get the name of the main bad guy of the series, and that he's writing the script of mankind's demise. And it's the Exorcist's duty to stop him. And that's where chapter 1 ends. It's kind of a hefty chapter because it has like a lot of lore. It explains the whole backstory of Akumas, as well as giving Claire, Moa, and Mark their backstory for a few pages, and naturally introducing our main character. So it has a lot to do in its chapter, but I think it does a very good job of setting up the story and definitely creating intrigue. I don't think this chapter really makes me be like, I need the next chapter immediately, but it does make me curious about the world and more to it. I like, you kind of have the cliche of the main character is super powerful compared to the low level threat that we see at the beginning of the story, where he one shots the Sakuma. So honestly, he could have dealt with it earlier, but he was kind of consoling Moa. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on chapter 1, and if you're excited for the series to continue, as we have 240 plus more of these to go to catch up to where this chapter review started. And if I really become way better of a reviewer by that point, or have a whole new retrospective on one of the chapters I've already reviewed, I'm happy to re-review that later. It's going to be far in the future, so maybe I'll even have more concepts on that, but I don't know. I feel like as I look more into this, there'll be like video ideas that I want to do. If you guys want more videos like that Pope video I made, please let me know. I'm happy to make more. Like I haven't made that many D.Gray Man like non-chapter review videos. I've made one on the third Exorcist, which is something that's also a pretty deep spoiler, and I've made one on the Pope. So if you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, and stick around for the next chapter or any of the current chapter reviews I have up. Thank you, and bye.